My name is Nishant Shahani. I am Associate Professor and Interim Director of the Program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the Pullman campus at WSU. Before we begin, I'd like to take a quick moment to say that WSU Pullman is located on the homelands of the Namipu, Nez Perce tribe and Palouse people. We acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, the Department of Fine Arts, and the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at WSU. The Hockenhall Lecture Series was launched in 1996 by the Women's Studies Department in collaboration with the Department of Fine Arts to honor Jo Hockenhall, a WSU Emeritus Professor of Fine Arts who served as Director of Women's Studies for more than a decade. Past lecturers have been visual artists, poets, and performance artists who have emphasized the important connections between art, social justice, and political practice. Former lecturers have included Octavia Butler, Coco Fusco, the Guerrilla Girls, and Anna Chavez, Jin Mi-yoon, just to name a few. This year, we are very excited to have Alison Saar as our featured artist.
Yes.
Before I introduce Jo Hockenhall, I just want to thank the people who have worked to organize this event. Thank you to the folks on the planning committee who are Fine Arts Chair Squeak Meisel, Executive Director of the Museum Ryan Hardesty, and Education Coordinator of the Museum Kristen Becker. Thanks very much to Debbie Stinson and Marion Shakatano for work on publicity. Thanks to the Director of WGSS, Pamela Toma, for all the initial work on planning this lecture. And finally, much gratitude to staff, Krista Brand in Fine Arts and Abigail Dallas in English for helping with various logistics. I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce Jo Hockenhall before we move on to Alison's lecture. And while I do so, I have a few images of Jo's work that you all can see. I hope I can still do that. If technology, there we go. Jo was the first woman hired in a full-time studio art position at WSU. This was in 1973. She also served as director of the Women's Studies Department and associate dean of the Vancouver campus. As the second director of Women's Studies, Jo was instrumental in doing the hard labor of speaking with deans and admin to hire more women scholars and instructors at WSU. She reached out to departments across colleges and school to get women's studies classes cross-listed so that interdisciplinary feminist perspectives were not only included, but also centralized at our university. Along with other faculty members, Jo organized writing retreats and formalized mentorship processes for women faculty at WSU. Jo's accomplishments to the art world are various, and I'm going to just mention a few of them. Jo wrote and received 11 NEA grants to bring nationally known visual artists to the Northwest to work for a week with students at WSU, U of I, and Spokane Falls Community College. She was the first vice president of the National Women's Caucus for Art. Jo was an NGO delegate to the 4th United Nations World Conference on Women and NGO Forum in Beijing, China. She organized 100 artists to attend and present at this conference. Jo has worked with several Native groups and Indigenous people as a project director or part of the planning committee for various exhibits and events. She worked with the Nez Perce Tribe, WSU Department of Anthropology, and WSU Museum of Art to organize and acquire grants for the exhibit and book, Song to the Creator, Traditional Arts of Native American Women of the Plateau. Finally, Jo has curated several exhibitions, including Spirits Keep Whistling Us Home, Contemporary Plateau Indian Women Artists at the Sacred Circle Gallery, Seattle, 1993. Please join me in welcoming and recognizing Jo Hockenhall. Jo, would you like to say a few words?
I pressed the right button finally.
Good, good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nishant, for that introduction. The Visiting Artist Project has been incredibly important to me for a long time. Now, why is that? It's sort of a personal story, and I'll take a half a minute to tell you. As a child, I spent a lot of time wandering through the galleries at the Chicago Art Institute. First with my mother, then later with friends, other students from the free art classes we had at the Institute. And later as a teenager and beyond, I found it to be a very magic place where I could just let my imagination go. However, one day out of the blue, as many teenagers are, I was struck by a realization that these art makers I was admiring, I was, having these wonderful magic moments with, we're all dead. And beyond that, how few women cross my paths in these wonderful wanderings. So these thoughts remained with me for all my life. In my teaching journey, I plan for living, breathing artists of all genders to interact with my students. And this brings us to today. So I too invite all of you out there to celebrate the life and work of Alison Saar. And from the bottom of my heart, I welcome Alison and thank you for your contributions to art, to women, for sharing them with us today.
My name is Sarah. I'm a third-year grad student here at WSU, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to Alison Saar to speak with us tonight. Alison Saar is a Los Angeles, California-based sculptor, mixed media artist, and installation artist. Saar was born in Los Angeles to a well-known African-American sculptor and installation artist, Betty Saar, and Richard Saar, an art conservationist. Saar studied studio art and art history at Scripps College in Claremont, California, receiving a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1978. In 1981, she earned her Master of Fine Arts degree from the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles. And in 1983, Saar became an artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem, incorporating found objects from the city environment. Saar completed another residency in Roswell, New Mexico in 1985, which augmented her urban style with Southwest Native American and Mexican influences. Saar's style encompasses a multitude of personal, artistic, and cultural references that reflect the plurality of her own experiences. Her sculptures, installations, and prints incorporate found objects, including wood, oil tin ceiling panels, nails, shards of pottery, glass, and urban detritus. The resulting figures and objects become powerful totems exploring issues of gender, race, heritage, and history. Saar's art is included in museums and private collections across the US, including her Mirror, the Prints of Alison Saar exhibition currently on view at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. So I'll pass it over to you, Alison.
Thank you for Joe for inviting me to do this lecture. I'm just really honored. Earlier you were speaking and you had mentioned that Octavia Butler was one of your presenters. And of course, you know, she's the it girl now, but back then, you know, a lot of people were not, she wasn't getting her due recognition. And so I really appreciate you're really being kind of ahead of the times and inviting really important artists of color and women to have their voice heard. So thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Jordan Schnitzer for being so kind as to lend the works for the exhibition that is currently at WSU. And thank you, WSU, for inviting me and hosting this event. Now, without further ado, let's just jump on this and we'll hop onto this. And we can share that screen. Is that working for everyone? Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Let me get to, so yeah, I guess I should start out. You mentioned briefly that I came from parents of two artists. And so I think, you know, my father, who was very traditionally trained in, you know, kind of looking at classics and things like that, was very instrumental in terms of the form of the work. And then my mother, Betty Saar, Richard Saar is my father's name. My mother, Betty Saar, was very much involved in, you know, content looking at African art, African-American art, and African diasporic arts, as well as other cultures and things like that. And so I think the work really comes as a marriage of those two influences in my life. This piece is called Dying Slave. I'm sorry, that's such a crummy image. I'll have to fix that. But it's basically African-American sort of rendition of Michelangelo's Dying Slave. Mm-hmm. This piece is called Blonde Dreams. And yeah, so I would say primarily my work is really kind of looking at issues of race and gender, sometimes combined in one, and later started really developing and looking at other spirituality, the ideas. But this piece, Blonde Dreams, is kind of this sort of Rapunzel. You know, she's kind of, I think, bemoaning her dark skin and realizing that if she had long, blonde, beautiful hair, she could toss it out the window and Prince Charming would come and make her life very rosy. And just kind of, you know, these ideas that, we are often kind of being, I know women have always been presented as kind of blonde and blue-eyed and things like that. And so is really kind of talking about, you know, the need for the shifting of those ideas of beauty and acceptance. And so this piece is done in the 80s. We've come a long way since then. But and this one is called Chaos in the Kitchen. So I should briefly, I don't talk much about my method or methodologies, but I'll just say it now to get it out of the way. So primarily these are all wooden carvings underneath this sort of cladding of either copper or in this case ceiling tin, which is the pressed decorative tin that's up on this, up on the ceiling. And then here the hair is made out of wire, and then it's got all these different objects embedded or kind of tangled up in there. And there are many reoccurring themes in my work, which you will see. Wire and hair is really important, I think, because it's kind of what because my appearance is to be white. I'm biracial. My mother is Black, but I identify as Black, even though I appear to be white. And so I think my hair is kind of the only thing that really sort of harkens back to my Black ancestry in terms of my appearance. And so I'm also just really fascinated with hair and hair culture, and it ebb and flows in terms of how important that becomes in the work, but you'll see it rises to the surface quite often. But this piece, Chaos in the Kitchen is kind of like this kind of curly, kinky bit of your hair in the back. And I was kind of interested in kind of talking about the hair as the gathering, your hair as being a biographer. And so she has all these different objects in her hair that really kind of talk about her life. It's kind of her diary. This piece is called Strange Fruit. Music is very inspirational for me. Strange Fruit, of course, is a song made famous by Billie Holiday, and is talking about lynchings. And so this, I'm often have these sort of what I call sort of inverted lynchings, and kind of how, we are not maybe physically lynched, but emotionally lynched, or emotionally kind of put up and out there. And so this piece is, the title of this piece also kind of really talks about sort of, again, looking at beauty and how, for so many years, only white women would be on the cover of magazines. And then slowly that started to change. But like in the 80s, a lot of times Black women would be featured in these fashion articles, but they would still be wearing kind of tribal clothes or tribal patterns, or being kind of like dressed, with kind of extraordinary, exotic, they were constantly being kind of fed to the public as exotica or the other. And so here she is as an exotic piece of fruit kind of waiting to be plucked and consumed. And I wanted it to be kind of ambiguous whether she's pleasuring herself or whether she's trying to conceal herself. This piece is called Traveling Light. This is one of the first bronzes I made. It's actually a gong. There's a small hole in the back of his, in the kind of the curve of his back, and it's hollow. So I was looking at kind of traditional Japanese and Chinese temple gongs, which are these long kind of cylindrical cast metal bells. And I love that the sound is this kind of like, you almost feel it more than you hear. It has this real sort of, it hits you in your gut more than your ears. And this piece is about apathy. And so while he is kind of being strung up upside down, and it kind of also kind of looks back to the tarot card, the Fool, where he's hanging by one foot, and this idea that you can help yourself, you can free yourself if you make the effort to it. And I think, in his case, he's kind of been, whether it's because he's been set back so many times with bigotry and racism, or what, he's basically kind of given up the struggle and given up the fight. And so his eyes are empty, his entire body is hollow. And so it's about apathy, and it's called Traveling Light, which is again another song made famous by Billie Holiday about how, having been burned and loved so many times, she's never going to be loved. She's never going to love again. She's never going to have passion or feel passionate about anything again. This piece is called Terra Firma. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles and did my education at Scripps and Otis. And then I moved to New York. And for me, it was really moving to New York in 1981 was a tough time. And I think we're seeing sort of a similar climate now where homelessness is really rampant. And there are so many people living on the street. And I grew up in Laurel Canyon. And, so for me to be like in the heart of New York City and really having coming face to face with the houseless and, astute poverty, it was really challenging to really understand what my role as a homed person was to somehow help and alleviate the situation. And so this piece was originally sort of shown at Hirshhorn, and we put him basically in blocking the entrance. So you had to kind of like skirt around him or step over him. And so it kind of became a sort of performative thing where the viewer had to make a decision how they were going to address this piece and how in turn, hopefully they would address this, blight on our civilization in terms of not being able to find homes for everybody. And so that's, he's life size. And then let's move on to the next, and it's titled Terra Firma. And then I also started doing these series that were kind of figures that were turning into tools. And this comes from looking at a lot of African work, specifically West African, looking at the Louver and that work out of Nigeria and Yoruba. And so, in that it was kind of like the tool was then kind of like this sort of representational tool, kind of a fly whisk would kind of like, would be like a symbol of royalty and things like this. And so I was really interested in kind of doing these portraits using tools of labor. And so this piece is called Dig. And so the figure is sort of digging in, ready to defend himself. And then I carved these bat boys. And, on one hand, it's kind of, looking at sort of the racism that existed that basically banned Black African Americans from playing in baseball for so long until 1960s, basically when Jackie Robinson was brought into the leagues. But it also is talking about, availability of recreation and sports for young boys of color, and how, often only more affluential parks had access to baseball and sporting equipment and all of those things. And so it's kind of looking at those two sides of it. This piece is called Cool Maman. And so there are two Yoruba deities that I feel indebted to in my life and in my creativity. And one would be Yemaya. She's the goddess of the water and mother of many Orisha. And so for her, I feel she gives me creativity. I think she gives me the patience for nurturing in both in the studio and in the home and with my family. And so she's a cooling water. And so she has stacked upon her head all of these dishes, these white dishes. And then it also kind of becomes what they call a pitumitan, which is a center post in Voodoo temples where the spirit can come sliding down. So this is sort of an invitation for her spirit to come sliding down and participate with us. And she's about 6 feet, and then an additional maybe 4 feet of dishes, so 10 feet all in all. And the other one would be Ogun. The title of this piece is called Smokin' Papa Shode. A shodi is like a cast iron pot. And so Ogun is sort of the god of iron, which can be weapons or can be tools. And since he is often shrines for him. You'll often find shrines for him in wood carvers studios, so to speak. And so because they work with very sharp tools. And so since I work with a chainsaw and other rather dangerous implements, I like to kind of appease him. And it's also very much about the cutting and the work of cutting and all those things. And so he has stacked upon his heads all things made of iron. So we have horseshoes and tools and ladles, and actually the ladle is a foundry ladle for pouring lead. And so he has all things metal, which is kind of a more masculine side of my practice. This piece is called Compton Nocturne, again, kind of looking at music as an inspiration, and Harlem Nocturne, a song that was written by Duke Ellington. Being from California, I kind of switched that up to call it Compton Nocturne. And it's kind of playing off of the odalisque, figure laying down. But for her, she has these bottles, and it's looking at the tradition of bottle trees, which are basically sort of to entrap spirits so they won't come into your house and be messing with you. And so in this case, she's kind of, these bottles are trapping her own spirits and her own ideas, her own dreams. And she's also life size. And that tin is basically this patterned ceiling tin. And so a lot of the coloration is, in this case, rust, just as I find the materials. This piece is called Taint. And so there are a few works that I have that really kind of deal with kind of trying to address my racial mix of being biracial. And so this piece is called Taint because she taint white and she taint black. And what it was is I carved the figure and I covered it with like a kaolin. And then these roots are dipped in tar. And so I put the roots on for her hair, and then I sprayed them, and then the tar kind of seeped down and tainted. So this white figure is kind of tainted by her obviously black hair. And I think, this would be an issue in times of, say, even for my mother's generation, where it was so crucial to have fine hair and good hair to be able to pass, to be able to have opportunities and options for jobs, marriage, everything. I don't know if many people have seen the really wonderful film out called Passing, based on Nella Larson's Harlem Renaissance book about that subject exactly, as terms of having to deny your ancestry in order to have access to, you did have opportunities. This piece is called Mirror, Mirror, or Negress, right, Mulatta Seeking Inner Negress. And so I think this piece might be at the show. And the print of it, I think, is basically, it's also part of the exhibition that's currently at WSU called Mirror, Mirror. And so this is a fair-skinned mulatto like myself, and she's looking in the skillet to find a reflection of herself. And so the skillet then has this sort of casting of her face, so she can see her Black ancestry in this mirror, which is actually a skillet. This piece is called Rise, Sally Rise. If you look at the kind of the long trajectory of my work, you can see when I had children, what stage my children were, and kind of what I was experiencing as a mother as well as an artist. And I think Rise, Sally Rise was made while I was on a residency, and my mother had sent me a photo of my daughter, Maddie, who I think was maybe 9 or 10 at the time. And she was like wearing like booty shorts and had this sort of midriff thing. And it was kind of terrifying to, be gone for like basically a month, and all of a sudden your daughter's, into, pre-adolescence. And it was kind of a frightening sort of jolt for me. And so the title Rise, Sally Rise is from the little children's song called Little Sally Walker Sitting in a Saucer. Rise, Sally Rise, wipe your weeping eyes, put your hands on your hips and let your backbone slip. And you shake it to the east and you shake it to the west and you shake it to the one that you love the best. And, I was always kind of curious as to, why Sally Walker was sitting in a saucer crying her eyes out. And then when I had an adolescent daughter, I realized that just comes with the territory of kind of changing from, a child, a girl, into a woman. And, it's an emotional roller coaster. It's a lot of stuff going on. And so this was kind of how I responded to that photo of my daughter, and kind of seeing that she was evolving into a young woman. And the sculpture doesn't have a face because, you know, I couldn't really project as to who Maddie was going to be at that point. And so it was just sort of this anticipation, this anxiety of having your baby grow up. This piece is called Inheritance, and it was done after I did a visit to Senegal. And was kind of blown away by these children who were basically helping their mother, you know, carry stuff or do laundry or care for their younger siblings, you know, carrying their younger siblings on their back and whatnot, and how really what a stark difference that was to children growing up in America, in the United States, and definitely a contrast to my own children. And so just kind of wanted to make this piece kind of honoring all the child atlases of the world. And so she is basically modeled after Maddie, who's probably like 6 or 7 at the time, and kind of having this swaddled, wounded world upon her head, and kind of talking about how, you know, our fate is in their hands at a certain point. This piece is called Lost and Found. One of my biggest fears is going mad. And so this is 2 selves, a lost self and a found self. And we are bound together by our hair. And there are women sitting in children's chairs. And I think, yeah, so it says lost on the back of one chair and then on the other as well. And these are also children's chairs, so these are life scale. And this piece is called Coup. Again, you know, it's always been a struggle as, you know, a working, full-time working artist, and trying to juggle and balance, you know, raising children and having a career. And I think, you know, this was a piece where all of that was starting to shift. And I felt like, oh, I could kind of cut away all of that baggage of having to care for someone else, or, you know, care for my 2 children, and also kind of wanting to cut sort of the work, you know, cut and start anew, even in terms of my work and ideas. And so here is a sort of a self-portrait poised with rather large shears, preparing to cut loose all of this stuff that you drag around. And then this piece is called Mofro. This piece is it's a challenge for my studio assistant because this is barbed wire, and it was really, I felt so bad for her having to like nail all of these pieces on. But basically just, you know, tough lady, you know, kind of looking at some of the really powerful women, you know, that were first being, you know, kind of being seen through the Black Panther Party, and, you know, amazing, and many of them still amazing and powerful, you know, and kind of continuing the struggle to have African-American rights recognized. And this piece is Cachet. So basically this is, again, this kind of prone figure laying down on the side, and her hair, she's dreaming this, she's got this giant hairball. Again, this idea that your hair is a biographer, so kind of contained and all that, you can imagine what her dreams and her aspirations are. She's also life scale. And when I say life scale, I'm 6'2", but most of my gals are like 6 feet. So big gals. This piece is called Suckle. They're cast bronze, but they're made from, I took what do you call, molds of a bunch of really beautiful worn skillets, especially when they get all kind of caked and greasy on the back, and then modeled all these different size breasts on them. And it was kind of this sort of pulling from the imagery of the granary doors from Mali. So they basically would often have women's breast on the front of it. And I think, you know, this kind of is attributing sort of women to nurturers and securers of food. And so I wanted to kind of make an American version of it. So this is all these different skillets. And then this piece is called Equinox. I think, you know, part of my studies at Scripps College was it had a really strong humanities and looking a lot at the classics, which I think crops up in my work often. And I'm also often seeing sort of correlations in Yoruba mythology and mythologies, transatlantic mythologies that have come here to the Americas. And so this is basically Persephone in the underworld holding two pomegranates and her mother Demeter on top, and her mother sort of expressing this milk out of this sorrow of having lost her daughter, and then the juice of the pomegranates coming up, and they meet at this equinox where Persephone is able to come back in spring to visit her mother. And then this again is Demeter just kind of mourning the loss. And I should say that these works were done around the time that my daughter was preparing to leave home and go away to college. And so I was kind of feeling this sort of loss that she was being taken away. And it's just a real, I mean, I don't know, I think nursing mothers would have a really good understanding of what that feeling is, where it's just kind of like, you know, not to be crude, but sort of this tugging at your teat sort of thing. And, you know, when you're lactating and your child isn't with you, you just, you know, it lets loose. I remember, not to gross anyone out, but I remember being in lectures and my daughter being in the back with my husband, and she would start crying and I would just start lactating on stage sort of thing. And so, you know, it's just this kind of like visceral sort of bodily function that happens. But again, it's really kind of this felt of not being able to provide for your children because they're no longer with you. And the Sea of Nectar. So the title is from Galileo's names for what he appeared to be seas on the moon. And I just thought they were such beautiful names. And then this piece is called Hither. When I installed this at Ellie Louver, which is my gallery here in Los Angeles, you came into the gallery, there's like 3 rooms. And so in the first room, you start seeing these little moths on the wall, and then you go in the next room and you see more and more moths. And then you go into this back room and she's there in the center of the room, and the walls almost all the way up to the ceiling are covered with these moths that are basically each one handmade. Is copper repoussé, where you basically draw onto copper and flip it. And so then you think, oh, you know, all of these moths are being attracted to her, but then detail shows that basically these moths are coming out of her. So she's emanating these moths. And I'm really interested in moths and other animals that kind of symbolize sort of go-betweens between 2 worlds, the real world and either the underworld or the spirit world or something like that. And so basically these moths are kind of speaking to her. This piece is called Brood. I think it's 8 or 9 child's chairs stacked up supporting this figure who is obviously too large to fit in this chair. And again, it was kind of looking at my daughter having, you know, become a woman. And so this girl is basically eating pomegranates, and the juice from the pomegranates is running down her chin and then running down between her legs and become her menses. And then this piece is called Bammy Machine. I was invited a few years ago, or many years ago at this point, to work with Pilchuck. And so I had these glass breast blown. And this was right after Obama was elected. And I was really, you know, on one hand, we all wanted to celebrate, but on the other hand, I think we started to see the tip of the iceberg of what we are experiencing this day in the political climate of racism and Nazism and white supremacists. And so I kind of wanted to create all of these sort of distilleries or these systems of what I thought was like, you know, what does it take? We have, you know, a Black man as president. What more does it take to kind of convince people, you know, that this is not a white world anymore? And so, you know, I kind of figured the only way to really get to understand this was to get the essence of bigotry. And so I kind of created these sort of systems of distillation. And so this one, the Bammy Machine, was kind of really looking back, I think, you know, where I was teaching, just doing little volunteering, I should say, at a high school where, you know, there were a lot of young women, Latinx, Latinx students who basically, you know, their parents were still housekeepers or whatnot, and how this is constantly sort of being looked down upon, and how, so this one was basically kind of looking at women of color as either housekeepers or cooks, or even harkening back to mammies. And so, questioning how, what needs to happen to kind of be able to break through these sort of stereotypes. And this basically is, you push this little bulb there, and it draws the water up from the wash tub and fills these breasts, and they lactate back into the basin. And so again, there's these kind of, and then the idea was that if you're not doing something to actively break these systems and arrest these systems, these cycles, then you are participating in them. And so by bringing the viewer in to participate is, I'm hoping that they would start to question, what am I doing to eradicate these practices and these beliefs? And then this piece is called Rouse. She's got this kind of paper figure on her, and I think I made it initially thinking it was a portrait of my daughter, and then I think it ended up being a portrait of myself, in that once my children left the home, and I think all these kind of antlers, which are antler sheds, no animals were harmed in the making of this piece of art, but these antler sheds kind of symbolize the amount of time it took to rear these children. And then then the thought was, well, I have an empty nest. If I am no longer a mother, then what am I? And so this is his kind of new self, the sort of nubile, sort of not fully formed self. And she's got this umbilical cord that's wrapped around her neck, but she's birthing and the birthee at the same time. So it's her belly button, and the umbilical cord is coming from her vagina, and so she's kind of birthing herself. And then this was also part of this kind of exploration of distilleries, and kind of looking at Obama specifically, and how that also, for myself, and being biracial, and how you're not Black enough for the Black community, and you're definitely not white enough for the white community, and kind of being in this limbo, and the idea of this quote unquote tragic mulatto. And so this one, you kind of bring this inky water up, and then it fills this heart halfway, and then it goes up into the head, and then it fills up to her eyes, and then she cries these Black tears back into this basin. And you have a choice of coal tar soap or ivory soap, and you had to sometimes have to kind of align yourself with one side or the other, but it was very little space to kind of exist in between. And then this piece is called Wait. Again, this sort of notion of women, young girls of color, and how often they're being pushed into excuse me, the occupations of their parents. This again came out of working in this high school, and getting these kids there. It was an arts high school, and they would make this amazing art, never having art classes before, and we would help them make applications for college, and they would get accepted into these colleges, and they would get even grants to go to these colleges, but it was still not enough to go there and be able to live and do this. These would be kids that would be first generation college goers, and often they would just say, I can't do it, I have to stay home and help take care of my younger siblings, or I have to help earn money so that my mother is not working night and day. And it was just really tragic to see that they have come so far, and they still were not being permitted to take that last step and kind of move beyond. And so this is a young girl who's sitting on this swing, but then then you see, oh well, this is not a joyful experience. She's been stripped bare, and this swing is attached to a cotton scale, and the cotton scale, her weight or her value is being equated by a cornucopia of tools of domesticity. So there is a skillet, and the coal scuttle is the cornucopia, and ropes, and irons, and all these things. And she's literally balancing that. So if you were to lift an object off of the counterbalance, she would come crash into the floor. So she just kind of like rotates and exists in this very tenuous state. It's called Wait. And this piece is called Undone. And I think, we all have these sort of misgivings for paths that we did not pursue. And so this is a girl who's hanging I think she was like 16 feet off the ground, and this umbilical cord with all these sort of bottles being tied to it. And this is idea of kind of, dreams deferred, and, what choices have we had to make, and how, those dreams are they basically, what's the word, fermenting, or are they festering? And whether we have, are we going to have the opportunity to go back and realize those dreams and those aspirations? And so it's called Undone. And that's a close-up of the bottles kind of cloaked underneath her long dress. And then this piece is called Sloth, and it's, again, about the sort of mourning, this idea of cutting all of your hair off. And this again was relating to, I'm so hung up on my kids, but becoming an empty nest and really feeling like my ballast had been taken away from me. And so this is sort of a self-portrait of basically the mourning of my children moving on and sloughing off all of this hair, and then kind of hopefully opening up for a new growth. I'm trying to remember what year this was, but a while ago I was invited to come to the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans to do an artist residency. And, I didn't want to go with a bunch of stuff. I really wanted to just get there and soak up Louisiana and New Orleans. My mother's father was from Louisiana, and he passed when she was a child, so I never got to meet him, but I was really always keen to kind of reconnect with that land, if not, all of my peoples were gone, but to reconnect in some form. And so when I went there, the only thing I took were these really beautiful stained sugar sacks that I had found at a flea market. And so I started doing these drawings of it. And I think, the studio was in the French Quarter, and the apartments were, the center is basically in the Esplanade, and I would ride my bike through the Treme. And this was some 5 years after Katrina, and there was still house after house after house, we're still boarded up, red X's on the door. And I just kind of was thinking, oh my God, everyone was saying New Orleans is going to come back better than ever, and it's going to be great, these people are going to have great homes. And there are still many people living in Texas and Alabama that have not been able to move back. Just basically how we were all fed a bunch of lies that, the government was going to take care of these people, and the government was going to, bring folks back. And it ended up, better than ever really equated to whiter than ever. And so it was just really heartbreaking to see that. And so this is the Cotton Eater, and it's kind of playing off of the Lotus Eaters in the Odyssey, from the Odyssey. And, where basically you're kind of, she's being fed these lies, and she's eating this cotton, and kind of and falsely becoming full by and so you don't know whether she's full from eating so much cotton, but also because there's no nutritional value, she could also be her stomach could be distended from starvation. And then this is the sculpted version, and she's carrying a long cotton picking bag. Then I actually had all these beautiful jugs. I call them moonshine jugs, but I think they had many functions. But I decided to kind of, someone was saying, my son was saying, but let's just clear out some studio space and get rid of these. And I'm like, no. And I said, they need to be bases. So they became these kind of like Aladdin's lamps. And so I wanted to make all of these gins or genies that were coming out of these moonshine jugs. And so this one is called Juke Joint Gin, which is really fun to say. It's dancing. And so, so that piece and that visit to Louisiana really got me interested in the history of African Americans living in floodplains and being displaced by rising waters, which is, something that we're continuing to face even more and more so. And so I went and looked back at the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. And that's where we get all these amazing pieces of music like Backwater Blues and Muddy Waters and all these amazing songs that came out of basically, you know, I was looking at images of the Great Mississippi Flood and of Katrina, and side by side, they were echoing each other. And, you know, 80 years had passed, but really nothing had changed. The policy had not changed to take care of these people who were being displaced. And so this is basically a woman who has gathered everything she owns or everything she can and is balancing it on her head. And she is literally poling down the middle of the gallery on this small raft. And then I started doing these sort of portraits of African-American men and women in water. And so, I mean, I was kind of really intrigued with sort of the power of water and looking at Yemaya and water deities, Mami Wata, all coming here to the Americas, and kind of how some certain traditions were carried on, like river baptisms and things like that. So there was one level where water is appreciated. It is a cleansing and a cooling, but it also can be very dangerous and can be deadly. And so I kind of created these women and men dancing in these waters. And this one is called Silt Town Shimmy. And these backgrounds are basically seed cloths and old sugar sacks and bits and pieces of mattress ticking that have all been hand sewn to kind of create these backgrounds. And a lot of these fabrics actually from the 30s. So they are kind of around the same time that the Mississippi flood, you know, was still impacting the United States, or the you know, that central part. And this one's called Sleepless Slide. And so these are maybe about 5 feet tall. And then this is a sculpture with the same title, Silt Town Shimmy. And I wanted to have silt on the piece, and living in Los Angeles, the only place to find silt is in the LA River. So this is probably like the world's most toxic silt, but there you have it. And then this piece is called Deluge, which is kind of also looking at this sort of water spirit and the power of a water spirit and the ability to wreak havoc when angered. And then Silted Brow is an homage to all of those that passed in Katrina and other floods that we have had even since Katrina. And then this piece, Acheron, is a portrait of Mami Wata. And so she appears to be a beautiful woman, but then in her reflection, you see she can also be very dangerous and very deadly. And I should say that these were drawn on, so all those trunks that were on top of Reach had these really beautiful drawers that were all lined with linen. And so I'd taken them out so I could stack the trunks inside of each other to be shipped around. And then these ended up being these really beautiful kind of ready-made canvases, because there were all these really beautiful linen tones. And so then I started doing these, in this case, this is a charcoal and gouache, charcoal and gesso drawing, painting. And then I did a piece called Hades DWP. If you're from LA, you know that stands for Department of Water and Power. And this was a collaboration with a wonderful poet in Portland. Well, I met her while she was in Portland, Oregon. I think she's now back in New York, but her name is Samia Bashir. And I've collaborated with poets in the past and hope to do more so in the future. But this was a thing where I'd done these sort of etchings on glass. And I asked her to kind of create these, what I was calling labels, but then when she did them, she said, oh no, these are their voices. And so these are the 5 rivers of Hades, and each one represents a different thing. And Lethe would be the middle one, which is the river of forgetting. And so it is blank. But so all of these really beautiful poems are just we typed them up on these little strips of fabric and then tied them to all of these different jars, and then all of the different ladles. You know, forgetting is kind of like the real biggie, and kind of going from our world to the underworld. And so that's like the big gulp. But they also kind of started to represent sort of these 5 stages of grief as well. So this was a piece from a show that I did at Ellie Louver called Topsy-Turvy. And it was really, I think generally I try to make my work, with hopes for, that have some sort of hope or component of healing. And I think that this was a time where it was just really impossible for me to kind of get over the anger that we were experiencing, as a nation and Black Lives Matters movement. And it really, this piece in particular came from looking at the video that was shot by Philando Castile's girlfriend, Diamond, I believe was her name. And you hear in the audio in the back, her daughter in the back seat, who was present when they basically shot him. It was just so incredulous. And you hear this little girl saying, basically, I don't want you to get shooted, mommy. And to me, it was kind of like, oh my God, how does this girl survive this trauma? What hope do we have that she will be able to grow and mature into a happy, loving child? And just, there are many children who have experienced the same thing, whether their parents have been shot in their car with them in the back seat, or whether their parents have been shot in the front lawn, by, supposedly the people that are supposed to be ensuring their safety, law enforcement. And so for me, it was just like, just really heart-wrenching. And I wanted to create these girl warriors to sort of empower these children that have experienced this trauma at the hands of law enforcement. And so these are, it's called High Cotton. There are 5 little girls, each one's holding a tool representing the 5 crops that were, basically the reason why slaves were brought to the United States, and really the crux of, why America, how the United States became such a wealthy nation. And so we have, going from left to right, we have sugar with the sickle. No, hold on a second. Rice. And then the front one is cotton. And then in the back, we have tobacco. And then we have sugar with a cane knife. And then we have indigo. And so this is them now using their tools of their labor become tools of the revolution and tools of the resurrection. And then this is White Guys, which is sort of a figure that's basically in the house. And so she's kind of like, and white guys, by that I mean, I'm talking about light-skinned slaves who were often the offspring of their masters. And so her being kind of inside and being lighter skinned, she would not draw as much attention. And so her tool is an iron, and a flat iron. If you look at the very tip of it, there's a drop of blood. And I should say they have these cotton bolls tied to their head because they're coming through the field. So this is their camouflage from coming through the cotton fields. And then this is the painting of the 5 girls. This is quite large. It's like 9 by 7 feet. And then this piece is called Topsy and the Golden Fleece. The interest in Topsy, which is, I guess, a minor character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom, but probably the most memorable character because she was later kind of basically ridiculed and kind of created into this, I don't know. It's the character is really complex in the way that Beatrice Stowe is writing it. This was a woman who was kind of talking about the evils of slavery, and this was a girl in the writing of it was talking about how this child was wild and unruly and unmanageable because she had basically been stripped of her parents and been beaten and mistreated as a child as a result of the the way slaves were being treated, the enslaved peoples were being treated. And I really wanted to kind of like empower that wildness and that resistance and that resilience, and saying this is what makes Topsy amazing in that she survived all of this, and she was still able to kind of question everything that was kind of being force fed her. And so in the story, Uncle Tom's Cabin, little Eva is on the deathbed, and she's handing out strands of her golden hair to all the slaves that have gathered around to, wish her well into the next world. And I think people have said that, this handing out of these golden strands of hair is about the gift of Christianity to the enslaved people. And what I wanted to do was like have Topsy in her, wisdom realize that this girl's power is in her golden hair. And rather than accept a few strands, she's just going to take the entire scalp. So she's holding the scalp of little Eva, which is gold leafed. And this is the wrath of Topsy. This is called bitter root, bitter fruit, bitter earth. I forget what it's called, sorry. And this is called Jubilee. So when I was doing the show, I promised myself the last piece would be something that would be celebratory. And so this is Topsy basically cutting off her braids and sort of a symbol of kind of liberating herself. And I think some of that harkens back to the practice of Chinese Americans that were brought here as indentured serfs, basically, and that it was often the cutting off of their braid was symbolic of being freed from their obligations and hence being independent at that point. And so she's basically kind of cutting off of her braids to free herself of her indentured status. And then this piece is called Grode. It comes from the title. The title comes from a portion in Uncle Tom's Cabin where Topsy's being asked, who made you? And they're trying to prod her to say, Jesus made me or God made me, and, have her embrace Christianity. And she says, well, I don't think nobody made me. I was just growed. And I just think, oh yeah, you tell him, sister, you tell him that no matter, how much you beat me, I am who I am and you are not my creator. And so here she is, growed and sitting on a cotton bale and holding a sickle and having her hair festooned with cotton bolls. And then I did a series of pieces that were kind of really looking at hair culture. I think after all of this, I was really feeling like I needed some healing. I needed some comfort. I needed a little bit of home love. And so I really kind of went back to sort of the culture of the kitchen, the African-American culture of the kitchen. And in the culture, in the kitchen, not only is food being made and conversations being had, but hair was also being pressed and combed. It was really, gathering around the hearth. Mostly women, sometimes guys were invited to this sort of cell as well. But so I kind of started looking at these hot combs, and I made these hot comb hanks. And a hot comb, basically you heat it up on the stove and, pomade your hair. And then as you pull it through, it straightens the hair, takes all the kink out of the hair. And I figured, oh, if all that kinky and wildness is being taken out of the hair, it's got to go somewhere. And so I created these haint figures to kind of gather that wildness and store it and hold it for you until there was a time where you're really ready to embrace your hair in its natural state. And then I did this piece titled, oh man, now I'm having one of those moments, Set to Simmer. And so again, playing off of the odalisque, usually it's a female figure that's being prone, I think she was supposed to be a concubine and inviting, kind of being this seductive, sort of sultry, sort of inviting glance. I wanted to turn that around. So I put her, she's laying on the kitchen table, basically, taboo in most folks' kitchen. And she is basically kind of daring, I guess basically it has this chair. People were invited to come into the space and sit in this chair. It's like, do not be looking at me askance out of the side of your eye or thinking you know me. Look at me. And if you want to see me, just look at me. And so you're forced to sit down there and kind of really look at this figure. She's got a frying pan, or, kind of as sort of an echo of the mirror and the odalisque, kind of looking at sort of concubines and vanity. that here it has become a weapon, you know, that you can look but don't touch. She has this kind of barbed wired hair as well. And then there's this drawer. And this was a collaboration I did with Dion Brand, a poet up in Canada. And I asked her basically to create these little poems. They ended up being these kind of curious little narratives. And so, you know, in that drawer, I don't know, I have one in my kitchen. Actually, I've got two of them in my kitchen where you kind of throw all of your bits and pieces. It was like my favorite place in my grandmother's home was to go through this drawer, which is bits of string or keys to nowhere, and, you know, matches and little scraps of paper and drawings, or, you know, whatever, spent spools of thread. And so she wrote these things. And so basically they're these little snippets that basically tell you who this woman is beyond the Black body, beyond this Black female body, that she's complex, she's has hopes, she has desires, she has dreams, and all these things. You're kind of led to all these kind of little insights to her in this little drawer of clutter. So this is inside of her mind. And then one of the other kitchen pieces I did, this was for a show called Chaos in the Kitchen, which was at Freeze. I have Kitchen Amazon. And so kind of, you know, Josephine Baker-esque style. Instead of having a skirt of bananas, she's got a skirt of skillets. And looking at the kind of, again, looking at Ulysses and the Queen of the Amazons, and how she had this girdle that gave her strength. And so this is kind of giving her strength and her power as someone who creates nutrition and who creates a space for growth and to those in her family and those she loves. And then, but she's also wicked. You don't want to cross her. So she's got a skillet as a weapon across her shoulder. I know this has gone on for a while. I got a couple more pieces to share, and then we can hopefully take some questions. This piece is called Torch Song. I think also out of sort of, you know, kind of the current movement, which is an extension of movements prior to, for the Black Lives Matters, looking at the continuation of the movement for civil rights. But this piece is basically kind of paying tribute to all of the women songstresses that have sung songs of protest, you know, namely women such as Odette or Nina Simone or, gosh, Mahalia Jackson. So many really powerful women out there whose voices have led us down a path to freedom. And so here she has these piano keys, kind of like bandoliers, you know, her weapon is her music. It's called Torch Song. And this is a piece I made for the show that was just closed at the Armory as part of an exhibition that I had called Ether and Earth, that was at Benton Museum in Pomona College and the Armory Pasadena Center for the Arts in Pasadena. And this piece is called Hygiena, and Hygiena is one of the three muses of health in Greek mythology. And, you know, I had this idea a while ago, kind of this idea of the spirit of cleaning and cleansing, both physical and spiritual. But then, you know, when we were getting ready to have the show open in September of 2021, we realized that we couldn't open the show, and we were really, actually it was in 2020. And so it took on a whole other meaning, looking at women and men who basically are helping maintain cleanliness. So this is an interesting space in the Armory. It's actually a munitions room. And so it's this strange, long, narrow room that feels very much like a broom closet. And so I kind of created this sort of altar of this figure, and she has a double-edged broom, a double-sided broom as a weapon to clean. And she's surrounded by glass containers, or glass coming on her head like bottle trees, but also all these different bottles hanging, and there's a soundtrack of dripping water going on. So it has this illusion that this water is kind of, it's raining inside of that space. And I just felt that, these people often come in, when everyone goes home and goes to bed, and they're coming in and they're cleaning the offices, or they're cleaning down, hospitals, and how, I think a lot of thanks have been given to people in the medical profession that have risked their lives in fighting COVID, but not enough recognition has been given to the people that basically keep everything clean and orderly. And so I really saw them, as spiritual cleansers as well. And so that's what this piece is. And then the last piece was a piece that I just had a show that I curated called Seen Unseen at Ellie Louver. And I created this figure, and she's in a room with all these, I think, like 30 mirrors hanging. And then she's holding basically, it's kind of hard to see, it's a little blown out light-wise, but all these bottles and light bulbs. And she is basically Oya, or a figure that is leading, the souls to the underworld or to the next space. And I think part of this piece came about because I know there were many people that passed during COVID, and because of COVID restrictions, we were unable to mourn the loss of our loved ones. My aunt died, and it was really, really difficult for my mother to let go of her baby sister because she was unable to have a proper funeral and memorial. And I think there are many people, those that have died of COVID and those that have not died of COVID, but it felt like these spirits were still floating around waiting for closure. And I know that many of us were waiting, or feeling very anxious because we're not able to have closure. And so I created this figure to help lead those spirits onto the next world. And that's all I've got to say. Do we have time for questions? I'm sorry if I went way over time, but
wonderful. Yeah, we have some time for questions.
Fantastic. Cool. Yeah. Let me escape there.
So I have a question right here. It says, in your piece, let's see, your piece have complex meanings. Do you ever find it hard to decide on a title?
Titles are the hardest part. In fact, I didn't even say the title of that last piece because the piece was in the show for the entirety of like 2 months without a title. And it was really hard for me to come up with a title. And I finally came up with one because the piece had been purchased and we had to tell the people the name of the piece that they just bought. So it's really difficult for me. It's really important. And I think, the title gives you an opportunity to kind of either contribute to the story or kind of throw in a counterpoint. Sometimes it'll look like one thing and the title will be something very different from what you would expect. And I think it's, an opportunity to kind of create a poem between the piece and words. And so, yeah, titles are really important to me. And sometimes they stump me because it has to be, I say le mot juste, it has to be the right words. So.
Great. Also, I have another question that was, it was actually asked twice. But is there significance to the blue lips in some of your sculptures?
It means different things in different times. I think some of the earlier ones, I think I did a piece called Bain Froid, which was kind of looking at, all of these, historical paintings and sculptures of women in their toilette, and, romanticizing, washing yourself in a bucket. And the truth of it is that water is damn cold if you got to wash yourself in a washed tub. And so the blue lips in that case symbolized, that she was freaking cold. And I think for the girls in High Cotton, the blue lips is kind of like when you're angry and you have your mouth terse and tense and the blood doesn't run to them anymore. You're basically, the blood's run out of your lips. And so they start to turn blue because you're so angry. So sometimes you're mad and sometimes you're cold, but that's how the blue lips come about.
I have one that's kind of based on your work, but it says, are the sugar sacks hard to work on?
The sugar sacks, it depends on in the actually more recent works, I've sort of been more embracing of how the grain kind of breaks up the image. So it's like painting on a really coarse canvas. I don't stretch them because I like them to just hang as they are. And some of them, because they're used, were quite fragile, so they have lots of mends and patches, which I love, because that kind of shows the history that they've been used. And many of those are actually taken from quilts that were then kind of reverted into these canvases, especially some of the ones that are in prints and stuff like that. And so, I kind of embrace that texture and the patching. So you just have to kind of let go of this idea that it's going to be a perfect, pristine sort of surface to kind of imprint your image on. It's a sort of a collaboration of those surfaces.
And then, so do you usually have a concept in mind before you begin your work, or do you figure that out as you go?
I always have a concept in mind, and I do a real rough drawing. When we were speaking earlier, we were talking about, do I have a sketchbook? And my sketchbook is really sparse. I'll just do like a real quick sketch, just enough to kind of figure out how many pieces of wood I need to glue together and then cut. But a lot of times the pieces will evolve in the process. I mean, that's the thing with sculptures, once you make the cut, there's really no going back unless you're like myself and I cheat with Bondo on occasion. But yeah, so, I kind of really have to have a set idea from the get-go. And a lot of times those ideas come from things I'm finding, like all of the skillets I'd collected forever, and then they ended up being the suckle piece. Sometimes it's the materials that really lead me to that path, but sometimes it's something, for example, the example for the high cotton, and really being inspired by that really heartbreaking video. So
Yeah. Another one kind of about the figures of yours. Is there a significance with most of the figures not having pupils?
That was something that started, I think, initially my really early work did have pupils. And they were usually actually done in mosaic or, for the sculptures. And then I think I started paring away things. And so I started kind of taking things off. And I think, when I was quite young, my father had given me a book on Roman sculptures. And of course, all of the, the eyes had dropped out of them because had like alabaster or marble eyes in them, and they had dropped out and they were like these masks. And I always thought they were really haunting in that you could, they would not return your gaze. And I think a lot of these really early pieces also were of women, almost like being presented. I think of Sajid Bachman, also known as the Hottentot Venus, and how she was put on display and kind of what sort of pain that woman experienced in terms of the ridicule and, frankly, just the really gross assault that she suffered, and being paraded nude and being touched and prodded by men under the pretense of science, and how by not returning that gaze, it was not being present, and that it was, trying to give her a way to escape. And so trying to give these women a way to escape this situation of being scrutinized. And so that was part of it. And then also I think, this notion of masks and how you can kind of put on a mask and that it becomes a protection. And so I think by not having these eyes and not acknowledging the viewer in some ways protects them and allows them to remove themselves from the situation. That sounds rather complex, but all of those things come into the make of that.
Yeah. So also thinking about kind of your frying pans and the materials, is there significance in the materials that you choose, and whereabouts do you find these materials?
Well, it used to just be from flea markets. Then I discovered estate sales. So I go to a lot of estate sales. And then, when I had to get 30 seed sacks or a bunch of sugar sacks, or 30 something celluloid French ivory mirrors, I started turning towards eBay, which is just really wonderful because it saves from going to I'd have to go to a lot of sales to find that. So when I'm looking for materials particularly, I will turn to eBay. But generally, I'm going to, you know, we have a great flea market here, the Pasadena PCC Community College flea market, which, you know, it's been like 2 years of no flea markets. It's like cold turkey, my addiction. I've had my supply cut off. Yeah, so I find these things, and, you know, and then every once in a while, like for example, for Hygiena, I needed a worn broom, and I didn't, you know, I had all plastic nylon brooms. And so, you know, I was coming home and I said, oh, I'm going to turn left here. And I went a block and there was one in the trash. So, you know, sometimes those materials or those objects call for me, and they present themselves to me.
Awesome. I have a few more questions here. Can you tell us about the concept behind Cat's Cradle? And the question says, I noticed location as a key motif in some of your works you shared earlier, but I'm curious about the significance of menses in Cat's Cradle.
Right, right. So yeah, and I think a lot of people see that piece and don't even see what's happening there. But again, it's kind of, again, you know, young girls going from childhood into womanhood. And so this is a girl who started her menses. And so, you know, she's taking, you know, her bleeding menses and playing a game of cat's cradle with it. And so this kind of thread leads back into her vagina. And this idea of kind of like being between two worlds where, you know, you're officially, you know, scientifically into womanhood, but you still have the heart and maybe the mind of a child, and trying to grapple with these two sides of yourself.
Wonderful. What's been your experience like working with the chainsaw?
I was really terrified at first. In fact, when I first got my chainsaw, I was in a residency in New Mexico, and I was so worried that someone was going to come in and take my chainsaw and chop me up that I hid the extension cord so no one could do that. So it's a powerful tool. It's you know, something to respect. I love my chainsaws. They're really great at cutting a lot of material away. I'm very impatient with process. And so, yeah, I really like them because, you know, it's the only thing that really allows me to work on that scale. I think if I were smarter and had different tools, I would be able to build things without having basically make a refrigerator block of wood and then carve a figure out of it. But I don't think that far in advance, so, or I can't. I'm very much my vision is very much about reductive and taking away, as opposed to, you know, I think there's two types of builders, two types of sculptors, and there's, you know, for example, my daughter works in clay and she can't take away, she can only additive, she can only build. So, you know, that's just the way my mind works. So chainsaws help me realize that.
Wonderful. So here's another one is, did people like Toni Morrison or Billie Holiday inspire some of your works?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I think music, I think maybe because it's more automatic, you know, sometimes I'm listening to music and images will literally come to me. I know I've been a menace in many occult concerts, you know, listening to someone like Phil Glass or something, and I'm like, oh my God, I've got to write something down right now, you know, especially in those spaces where music, where you're so deeply ensconced and so basically, you know, in that space with music, such as in a concert hall, that it really takes you places that you wouldn't be able to get to, you know, just from your mind. And so I think music has always been really powerful. My father listened to a lot of jazz and blues. And so those were the first songs I sang, were songs of Nina Simone and Billie Holiday and Diana Washington. And so those were, so they continue to be very influential. And reading as well, you know, I'm kind of, I think I had issues with it was very difficult for me to read. I was a very slow learner in reading. And so it wasn't until basically I was kind of coming out of college that I really when I didn't have to read, that I really began to read a lot and really love reading. So I read a lot now. And I think maybe what's most influential to me now are Black female writers, hence working with E.B. Shockley and Dion Brand and Samia Bashir and, all these other really wonderful women poets that I'm really drawing a lot of inspiration, and men as well. But the ladies are always kind of the first books that I pick up.
Wonderful. Here's another one. Is it hard to sculpt your sculptures, like the face, especially with the materials that you work with?
You have to, every once in a while I think, oh God, this would be so much easier to do in clay. But then, clay likes to break and stuff like that. So, you have to realize that the wood is going to push back and that you need to sort of compromise. So I'm working on a piece now and it's just like, oh my God, this is taking forever. When I do, for example, when I had to do the hot comb haints, they're really small. I think she's only like 7 inches or 8 inches tall. So I had to get out a magnifying glass and I had to buy new tools, which are these really tiny whittling tools to really get into those features. So some of them are a little bit more challenging than others. But, when I'm doing the life scale pieces, they're really physically a lot of work, using a chainsaw, carving, a big chunk of wood, and then using mallets. I have great upper body strength because, that's what it's all about. So, yeah, sometimes it's physically quite taxing.
Wonderful. So I think we have time for a couple more. Was there unusual pressure in having artist parents?
When I was in high school, and I remember bringing up a drawing, I went to my art teacher and he said, oh, your mother just got an NEA, that's so great. And he was going on and on and on. And I was just like, but what about my picture? And I think, at that point I really started pulling back. And so when I went to college, I really was pursuing being an art historian. And I worked with Dr. Smella Lewis, who's my mentor there, and who had written some of the first books on contemporary African-American art in the 1960s, maybe it was 70s by then, 70s. And I was also looking at African art and the art of the African diaspora. So that was really my focus. But then, I just realized I'm much better at making things than writing about things. And there was also just something that was just so deeply gratifying about going into a space with a few tools and a chunk of wood and being able to come out with something that really meant something to myself. And so yeah, I resisted it for a really long time.
Great. Can you comment on etching on glass and how it's different from or similar to drawing, sculptures, and painting?
Well, it's, it is basically drawing. And, I've done, so what it is basically just, it's pretty simple and it's kind of fun and it's a really inexpensive tool. It's just like a little pen engraving tool. They're like, I don't know, $20 or something. And you put diamond burrs in them. You can find different sizes and different shaped burrs to carve into them. And you just basically draw. It's drawing. But what I love about it, and when it was cool about those bottles, and what you can't really see is that platform basically has a light underneath it for Hades DWP. So when the lights are turned off, those drawings become invisible. But when you turn the lights on and the light is passing up through the glass, then the broken edges of the glass kind of become these really strong white lines. And so I kind of love this, that these are kind of like these funny invisible drawings. And I've also done, when I was up at Pilchuck, I don't know what the vitrograph, I don't know what the official word is for it, but when you use either etching solutions that'll basically eat into the glass, acids that'll eat into the glass, or using tools to scrape and cut into the glass. And then you ink it up and you print it like a printing plate. So that was something really interesting. It's something you can't really do at home. You have to have a really super flat etching press bed because any variation in that will crack the glass. But that was something that was new to me. And so that was similar to printmaking on just a regular, be like doing a dry point, well, on an etching plate. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, this looks like all the time we have for the questions. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you for these wonderful questions. Thank you, Joe, so much for hosting this. And I appreciate being able to speak with Squeak earlier and the students. It was really lovely seeing your work. So thank you so much. And
Thank you so much, Allison. We really appreciate all your generosity and time.
My pleasure. I wish we could have done this in person, but maybe sometime in the future. But this is good. Like you said, we got a lot of folks in today, so that was great.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.